The United States government just paused all military aid to Ukraine. A shipment of $1 billion worth of air defense missiles, vehicles, and ammunition that was already in transit to Ukraine was halted by the Trump administration after a massive argument broke out in the Oval Office with Ukrainian President Zelensky over a minerals deal and security guarantees. Why does the U.S. government think this minerals deal would provide implicit security for Ukraine? Could U.S. military aid resume in the near future? What impact will cutting off American aid have on the front lines in the war? How might Russian forces seek to exploit this development? I'm your average infantryman, Chris Cappy. A lot to unpack here, so let's begin. The percentage of total military equipment that the U.S. supplies, according to the think tank ISW and our u.s.a, is about 30% of Ukraine's total military hardware. But whatever that exact figure is, the thing that everyone agrees on is that this percentage is some of the most important and effective and strategically vital to Ukraine's war efforts. For example, take a look at the Kherson region. Ukrainian and Russian forces have been battling here, separated by the Dnipro River. Every day, Russian forces are trying to cross the river to get a foothold on the other side. One of Russia's strategies for advancing is to use glide bomb airstrikes launched from jets to soften Ukraine's defensive positions. But these strikes can be inaccurate because Ukraine's air defense keeps these Russian jets at a distance and lowers their ability to run frequent missions against them. Supporting these efforts are 3 U.S.-provided Patriot surface-to-air missile batteries and 12 NASAMS, very sophisticated weapon systems. Keep in mind, each battery has 8 separate launchers which hold 4 missiles each, and the launcher has a max range of 160 kilometers in diameter, so we're talking about a pretty big air defense umbrella here. This is one of the places that Ukraine may feel the drop of U.S. military support the most, because those require fresh missiles to be shipped in, and without those systems, it might as well be bricks. All the reports I've seen suggest that this shortage could be felt within a matter of weeks when it comes to the air defense. So air defense remains one of the most important assets delivered because Ukraine struggles to produce these systems domestically. American anti-air support also included 3,000 Stinger anti-aircraft missiles, which are a handheld and portable by a single soldier. There's tons of combat footage of them shooting down Russian jets near the front lines with these kind of man-pad systems. I did a whole uncensored analysis of that footage on Pepperbox. But US support isn't just flashy, kinetic, deadly supplies. They also sent 20 air surveillance radar systems, which can send targeting information to all the various launchers. But if you've ever played with military equipment before, you know that that shit breaks down all the time, and you need spare parts from the United States, and you need technical support to fix it. And all of this feeds into the contested air superiority battle overhead, which greatly impacts the conditions on the ground. George Barros, an expert on the war for the Institute for the Study of War, said, quote, "There are certain niche systems and capabilities that the United States provides Ukraine that the Ukrainians do not have an analog for, and neither do the Europeans, particularly air defense interceptors," end quote. Ukraine is reportedly very reliant on those US-provided Patriot systems to protect specifically their rear strategic areas. They protect densely populated cities like Kyiv. I can confirm every night I was in Ukraine, there was a Russian ballistic missile attack or a drone attack on each city that I stayed in, and I'd be woken up in the middle of the night by alerts on my phone to go run to a bomb shelter. I started just sleeping through them though, because I decided death before losing more sleep. U.S. air defense also protects Ukraine's energy infrastructure. You know, their power plants in the rear, which are attacked frequently. When I was in Ukraine, I spoke to a representative of their thermal power plants, and he showed me one of the power generators that was destroyed by a Russian missile strike.
Actually, since October 2002, Russia sent about more than 1,000 attacks were on energy system. Energy system is in focus, it is a target for Russia.
According to an ISW assessment, Ukraine would have to make very difficult decisions about which populated centers they want to prioritize protecting over others when it comes to air defense. The place along the front line where we're seeing the biggest impact of U.S. military aid being paused is in Kursk, where we're seeing movement now. there's one major supply line into and out of the battle, which if you look at the live conflict map behind me, you can see reports of Russian bombardments of these lines, which threaten to cut off 10,000 Ukrainian troops that could become encircled. Ukrainian and Russian media sources are now both reporting that a full Ukrainian withdrawal from Kursk could be imminent. The commander of Ukrainian communications, u.s.a, said, quote, "It's true, we can't stop them. They just sweep us away, advancing in groups of 50 North Koreans, while we have only 6 men in our positions," end quote. And a pro-Russian military blogger named Two Majors claimed that the assault on a key town of Sudzha had begun. Recapturing the 2/3 of the territory that Ukraine holds in Kursk has come at significant costs to Russia and North Korean forces, whose progress has been slow throughout the past year. But on a personal note, I spent time with the Ukrainian soldiers in Kursk, and I understand what a struggle it has been for them to hold on to this territory, even with U.S. military aid. One of the contributing factors to this withdrawal so far that I think, if this continues in this direction, Ukraine has assessed that even if they hold onto this land, the new administration in the United States may not negotiate a peace deal that would allow them to swap that land either way. I feel like following these events, though, in the news gives me geopolitical whiplash, because the next day after the pause of U.S. military aid was announced, Ukraine's President Zelensky wrote on X that the Oval Office meeting was regrettable and he was willing to come back to the negotiating table to work on the minerals deal again. I keep hearing about this minerals deal. One potential way that U.S. military aid could be resumed is if this minerals deal that's been on the table is finally signed. This rare earths mineral deal would see billions of dollars worth of revenue from Ukraine put into a fund that would cover costs of the money that the United States has already invested in Ukraine. The way it would work is that hundreds of U.S. workers and citizens would work for U.S. mining companies that would be operating, drilling close to the front line in Ukraine. The implication here is that if Russia killed any of these American workers, captured territory, or threatened these economic interests, it would trigger a full-blown U.S. military response in retaliation. Be like one of those don't touch our boats moment. The idea that a U.S. mineral deal in Ukraine serves as an implicit security guarantee does follow a historical pattern where we can see that American economic interests are tied to military commitments. Rare earth minerals are a strategically important asset for the United States. The U.S. is short on, and they need rare earth minerals for things like advanced weapons production. However, on the flip side of that, history also suggests that these economic commitments are not always ironclad when it comes to security. So, remember in the Gulf War, that was an example of the U.S. protecting Kuwait's oil supplies, or Operation Just Cause, which was partly about securing U.S. economic interests with the Panama Canal. But I'm sure a lot of you also remember that the U.S. withdrew from South Vietnam in the 1970s, and there was a collapse there. They also left Afghanistan in 2021, and there was a collapse there. And they left behind American businesses and contractors who were still operating there. Complicating matters further is that the Russian government has already stated publicly that they would not sign a peace agreement that saw Europeans and European soldiers on the front lines, guaranteeing that peace. So the idea here is that the Russian government would also likely not sign a peace agreement with Ukraine where the US guaranteed in writing that they would enforce the terms of a ceasefire. So it appears that this is an attempt to find a loophole that suggests there would be US military involvement while also not committing to it in writing. It looks like an attempt to find something that all stakeholders here would be comfortable with signing, but it's not clear if that would actually work or not. It's possible that if a future US administration came in and decided that protecting the mineral businesses in Ukraine wasn't worth the risk for any number of reasons, then a mineral deal would not necessarily guarantee US military backing and involvement decades from now. Of course, we don't know the final terms of the agreement, and it's possible that these concerns that I just raised could be addressed in there if it does ever get signed. But these are aspects to the agreement that I think is important to keep in mind when we're thinking about it. Because like with all the videos I do here, my job, I try not to tell people what to think. There are plenty of people already doing that. I try my best to give a lens through which to think about these problems. Maybe I try to play mediator because I have an innate need for everyone to get along and stop fighting ever since my parents got divorced when I was 11. Maybe I'm holding out naive hope that the war can stop and not escalate. Or maybe we should talk about an aspect a little bit more tangible and easy to digest. I noticed that one of the things you guys always tell me in the comment section is how you appreciate that I try my best to stay objective and unbiased with reporting. Ground News is a website and an app that gathers news from all over the world and it puts it in one place. Then it gives me a clear way to navigate how every story is being told from different perspectives. For instance, I recently covered how the United States plans to destroy cartel terrorists, right? And there was a ton of information for me to sort through. Thanks to Ground News, though, I can quickly cut to the heart of the story, like this one, about the United States deploying spy planes to surveil Mexican drug cartels. Out of the 40-plus sources covering that story, Ground News shows me that most come from centrist outlets. But my favorite part is their interactive map feature that lets me explore news from all over the world. We're offering 40% off their Vantage plan at groundnews.com/task. This is a great discount on their best plan, exclusive to you Task and Purpose viewers, so I really recommend you give Ground News a shot by clicking the link in the description down below or the pinned comment below. When I reported from Ukraine, my life was saved by good intelligence reports. An intelligence guy identified a Russian drone was flying over where my vehicle was headed, and he radioed to the driver to turn around and get the f*** out of there. And he saved us with that intelligence. And this is a major aspect of U.S. military aid that I think people do not consider. U.S. provided intelligence reports. America gives high-fidelity satellite imagery and daily updates from sensitive U.S. human intelligence resources that are near impossible to replace. Since the start of the war, America has given Ukraine intelligence on location of Russian command outposts, where giant ammunition depots are located, and other targets of opportunity such as key supply lines. This gave Ukrainian forces a major buff to their stats when it came to executing missions. They had some early success in killing senior Russian generals, and for a while, their targeting abilities against Russian forces made them have to station their supply nodes further away from the front lines, which stretched their supply lines. To give you an idea of how extensive this cooperation was, listen to what CIA spooks told the New York Times. They revealed that they helped Ukraine establish a dozen listening outposts to eavesdrop on Russian planning, to know what they were doing ahead of time. The U.S. intelligence agencies also provided a secret gray fleet of commercial aircraft that provide logistics for resupplying the nation with weapons not just from the U.S. but European allies as well. More terrifying than thinking of facing an American Abrams is the fact that the U.S. military can put a Burger King anywhere in the world in 24 hours. Their logistics is insane. Without all this intelligence support, other allies would have to step up to fill that gap. But U.S. intelligence capabilities are difficult to match, especially when it comes to their space capabilities, which could potentially be turned off. The Starlink satellite communications network is vital to Ukraine's operations. It's fundamental to them. When I traveled all along the front line in Ukraine, there was a Starlink setup outside every safe house, and every vampire drone team and every hideout had a Starlink in order to communicate with their leadership, get intelligence reports, and this isn't sensitive information, it's widely published and well known that Ukrainian forces rely on Starlink. This could be counted as non-military aid, it's unclear to me if it is, but it's something that could potentially be cut. So far, the United States has provided an estimated $65.9 billion in terms of their military support to Ukraine. The U.S. is the largest individual donor of aid to Ukraine by a pretty large margin. This current cutoff could just be a temporary pause because it could be resumed in the future, though. And we know this because it's happened before. The last time the United States withheld military aid from Ukraine was in 2024, and it coincided with Russian advances along the front line. The Institute for the Study of War believes, quote, Russian forces will seek to exploit expected Ukrainian material shortages if the suspension of U.S. military assistance persists, as Russian forces did during the previous suspension of U.S. military in early 2024. The ISW goes on to point out that in early 2024, Russia took advantage and had overwhelming air superiority, and a 20-1 artillery advantage, which allowed them to advance in Pokrovsk and Avdiivka direction. And they launched an entire new campaign into Kharkiv. It could be a coincidence, maybe I'm connecting the dots that don't exist, but I don't think it's crazy to say that those instances are related. And when US military support resumed in 2024, the front lines stabilized again shortly afterwards. However, I'll say this: 2025 is different than 2024, and we don't know exactly what the impact will be here because of some major variables that have shifted around and changed that I'm going to get into later. So I'm going to quickly list off some of the most important key assets delivered by the United States, because it's going to be important to understanding the impact of the absence of this aid in just a minute. So the US sent hundreds of artillery pieces, 3 million artillery rounds, including 700,000 of which were mortar shells. America delivered 120,000 anti-vehicle weapons like your AT-4 rocket launchers, Javelin anti-tank missiles, some 10,000 TOW anti-tank missiles, 500 million small arms rounds, missiles for F-16 fighters, over 300 of the M2 Bradley infantry fighting vehicles, 40 of the HIMARS rocket launchers, and 50 ATACMS long-range missiles, and 1,300 armored personnel carriers, and 5,000 Humvees, and 400 Strykers. But here's the thing about all that equipment. It might sound like once it's in country, you're good and you're set, but without continued US military aid, the problem is that all these shiny, spicy weapons need boring, practical maintenance. Ukraine will have to find a workable solution for spare parts without US supplies, which is like finding a way to charge your Apple phone without an Apple product. And that's why the exact effects of this pause of US military aid is going to depend largely on how the US government decides to deem what is aid and what is not. If technical support is cut off, in addition to material support, it will have a very different and negative impact on Ukraine's abilities. Europe has increased their share of Ukraine's overall military aid since that happened last year, and they're now supplying an estimated 30% of the total, the US another 30%, and Ukraine produces some of their own weaponry. Whatever the exact numbers and percentages are though, for sure we know that the US leaves a large capability gap to be filled. Two anonymous US officials told ABC News that about 90% of the weapons that the United States committed to Ukraine through the previous administration had already arrived in Ukraine. Much of that was air defense, and the final 10% will arrive by August of 2025. So that leaves just some private weapons contracts with US companies that were already paid, which could extend out several years, but conflicting reports also suggest that the Trump administration may be seeking to prevent some of that already paid for aid from arriving as well. The ramifications of this move are still to be fully understood, but Jonathan Beale, a defense correspondent at BBC, posed an interesting question that hadn't occurred to me before. Does cutting off of US military aid mean that the US will prevent European countries from sending their US-made equipment to Ukraine? For example, he mentions that when Europe wanted to provide their US-manufactured F-16 fighter jets, they first had to ask America's approval because of the way the contracts are usually written up. Jonathan goes on to report that the United States has been training Ukrainian forces and helping to keep them maintained. This is true. I can corroborate that when I spoke to maintenance teams of M1 Abrams and Bradleys, they said they were in touch with American teams if they needed any help. Cutting off those lines would make these jobs more difficult. It's been about 2 months since the Department of Defense has announced any new military packages. The final remaining roughly $4 billion of aid that was authorized under the previous administration will be purchased from American defense companies and then shipped within the next 6 months if it's not prevented, which means we may see the impact very soon on the ground. When we look at the diplomatic angle here, this pause of military aid was characterized as a temporary suspending. But what will this mean on the tactical level? It's more likely now that if the United States aid doesn't resume, then Russian forces will gain more territory. And it could even mean that the Ukrainian front lines could break. If that happens, then Ukraine would have to accept a more unfavorable peace agreement. However, the front may not break. We know that German, Czech, Estonian, and Norwegian artillery incentives are reportedly enough to keep Ukraine's 155 firing at a rate of 5K per day or 2 million per year, even without American artillery shells. If things stay similar to how they've been, in theory, if that's the case, it could be enough to prevent a frontline collapse. 5K artillery is about half of what Russia sends out, which was never more clear to me than when my position was getting hit by Russian artillery and I could hear friendly outgoing fire being fired way less. even that has an effect on morale. As a human, only hearing your cannons going off half as much has a psychological effect on you. And that's something that I think is easy to forget with all the talk of this many missiles or that many bombs going to Ukraine or that many tanks being cut off. On top of all that, those reports of U.S. military aid being cut off has a psychological effect. When a Ukrainian soldier hears that they don't have American support anymore, they know how much of their equipment comes from there, and it's going to have an impact on how they fight. It's going to have a psychological impact on the troops because I know they monitor that kind of information very closely. It must feel like being out on a tree limb over a cliff. Trump has stated that the aid would continue if Ukraine showed what he believed to be a commitment to peace negotiations with Russia. I'll say just my personal thoughts and feelings are that I would like to see the U.S. provide some kind of solid security guarantee for Ukraine, and it would be great if Ukraine signed a mineral deal to help cover some of the costs of military aid that has been provided. I think most sane people want to see peace and an end to the fighting. It's just the terms of that peace that people can have difficulty agreeing on. I can understand why, from Ukraine's perspective, they don't trust Russia to respect any ceasefire or peace agreement that it's not guaranteed in black and white writing by the United States military. Because in the past, they feel that they've been violated by those agreements. The message from the United States appears to be that support now comes with conditions. The most recent reports I've seen suggest that Ukraine and the United States may be willing to try to sign a minerals deal again and give this another shot. We'll have to wait and see how that develops. Whether Ukraine can adapt, whether Europe can fill the capabilities gap, and whether Russia tries to seize this moment, those answers will be written in the months ahead, and I hope that you'll stay with us as we follow those developments. I'm your average infantryman, Chris Cappy. Thank you for watching.